My name is Harold Bennett, and by the time my son got engaged, I had already spent over 40 years building a business from nothing. I started with one rusted delivery truck, a rented storage unit, and enough debt to destroy most men. There were nights I slept inside warehouses because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll at the same time. My wife, Eleanor, stood beside me through all of it. She worked double shifts as a nurse while I hauled inventory across 3 states, and together we built Bennett Industrial Supply into one of the largest logistics companies in the region. But after Eleanor died from cancer 6 years ago, success stopped meaning much to me. I sold my penthouse, stopped attending business events, and moved into a quiet lakeside house where nobody cared about wealth or status. I still owned everything: the company, the properties, the investments, but I dressed simply, drove an old pickup truck, and lived quietly because I no longer felt the need to impress anyone. The only thing I truly cared about was my son Daniel. He had grown up privileged after the business became successful, and I'll admit now that I probably made life too easy for him. I gave him private schools, luxury vacations, and opportunities one never had myself because I wanted him to avoid the hardships I endured. What I didn't realize was that comfort was slowly changing the way he viewed people. When Daniel called to tell me he was getting married, I thought maybe life was finally giving us a chance to become close again. He sounded excited while describing his fiancée Vanessa Collins and her high-class family. That phrase bothered me immediately because he repeated it several times during the conversation, almost like he needed me to understand how important their status was. Still, I agreed to meet them at an expensive restaurant downtown. Before hanging up, Daniel awkwardly reminded me to dress well because Vanessa's family was particular about appearances. I remember staring at the phone after the call ended because no son should feel nervous about introducing his father unless something inside him is already broken. That night, I deliberately chose to wear old clothes and drive my pickup truck instead of my Mercedes because I wanted to see who these people really were before they knew anything about my finances. The reaction was immediate. Daniel looked horrified when he saw me step out of the truck. He pulled me aside near the entrance and whispered, "Dad, why would you come looking like this?" I smiled calmly and told him these were the same hands and clothes that built his entire life, but he only looked embarrassed. Inside the restaurant, Vanessa's parents treated me like background furniture from the very beginning. Charles Collins had the fake confidence of a man born wealthy rather than someone who earned anything himself, and his wife Linda kept scanning my clothes with barely disguised disgust. Throughout dinner, they asked insulting questions disguised as polite conversation. Charles asked whether I ever regretted spending my life doing manual labor, while Linda talked endlessly about private clubs, luxury cruises, and elite social circles before casually asking whether I had ever traveled outside the country. Daniel laughed along nervously instead of defending me, desperate for their approval like a teenager trying to impress rich classmates. Vanessa wasn't openly cruel at first, but she carried herself with the same quiet arrogance. One point the waiter accidentally spilled water near my seat, and Linda sighed loudly before saying, "This is why certain environments should remain refined." She looked directly at me. When she said it, the waiter apologized repeatedly, but everyone at the table understood who she was insulting. Daniel heard it clearly, yet he lowered his eyes instead of speaking up for his own father. That moment changed something inside me. I realized Daniel wasn't simply nervous about fitting into Vanessa's world. He was ashamed of me. Over the next few weeks, the situation became worse. Vanessa suddenly became very interested in whether I planned to contribute financially to the wedding. Linda constantly made comments about maintaining standards, while Charles joked about how difficult it must be for Daniel to carry financial pressure alone. One evening, Daniel visited my lakeside house and spent half the conversation asking indirect questions about my retirement savings. He looked disappointed when I answered vaguely instead of bragging about my wealth. Then he finally admitted Vanessa's family assumed I was struggling financially and hoped I could still help where possible. I asked him whether he cared what they thought about me, and after a long silence he replied, "Appearances matter to these people." That sentence stayed in my mind for days because Appearances had never mattered when Eleanor and I were sacrificing everything to build a future for him. A week later, Vanessa invited me to dinner at her parents' mansion, and I immediately sensed something was wrong because suddenly everyone acted unusually polite. Charles poured expensive whiskey while Linda complimented my jacket for the first time in her life. Then Charles leaned forward and calmly explained that marriage required financial planning. Linda added that I was getting older and living alone, suggesting it might be wise to move somewhere smaller and cheaper. Vanessa quietly agreed while Daniel sat there avoiding eye contact. Finally, Charles revealed the real purpose of the dinner by suggesting I transfer ownership of my lakeside property to Daniel before the wedding so the young couple could start their marriage with stronger assets. I stared directly at my son and asked whether he agreed with this conversation. After several painful seconds, he nodded and said it made practical sense. Practical sense. That was the phrase he used after everything his mother and I sacrificed for him. 2 days later, legal paperwork arrived at my home already prepared for the property transfer. They had actually assumed I would sign away my land because they believed I was weak, lonely, and financially desperate. That was the exact moment I decided none of them deserved another ounce of patience from me. On the day of the wedding, I arrived, wearing the same old suit they all hated. Guests whispered behind my back while Vanessa's wealthy relatives looked at me with open pity. During the reception, Charles gave a speech about marriage and family status, then publicly mocked me by saying one family brought sophistication while the other brought humility. The ballroom erupted with uncomfortable laughter, and the final knife in my chest came when Daniel laughed too. My own son laughed at me publicly to impress people who viewed him as nothing more than an investment opportunity. I stood slowly, reached into my pocket, and handed Daniel a thick envelope. The room became silent as he opened it. Inside were financial documents proving I owned Bennett Industrial Supply, multiple warehouses, commercial buildings, investment portfolios, and assets worth nearly $40 million. Vanessa grabbed the papers in shock, while Charles suddenly lost all confidence. Linda's face turned completely pale. Then I calmly explained that the majority of my fortune had already been transferred into a charitable foundation honoring Eleanor, meaning almost none of it would ever belong to Daniel. The same people who treated me like trash minutes earlier suddenly tried speaking respectfully, but it was too late. I looked directly at my son and told him the truth he needed to hear in front of everyone. I told him wealth never impressed me because I came from nothing, but character always mattered, and he failed the simplest test a man could face. When he believed his father was poor, he treated him with embarrassment instead of respect. Then I handed him one final letter written by Eleanor before her death. In that letter, she described every sacrifice we made to give him a better life and warned him never to judge people by money or status because arrogance destroys families from the inside. By the time he finished reading it, he was crying openly in front of hundreds of guests. I left the wedding without another word. 3 months later, Daniel arrived alone at my lakeside house looking thinner, exhausted, and completely broken. Vanessa had left him shortly after discovering most of the fortune was permanently inaccessible, and the Collins family disappeared the moment they realized there was no inheritance waiting for them. Daniel sat beside me on the porch for nearly an hour before finally admitting the truth. He said the worst part wasn't losing Vanessa. The worst part was realizing how quickly he stopped respecting the man who raised him simply because he thought that man was poor. I told him money doesn't change people. It reveals them. And unfortunately for him, the wedding revealed everyone's true face before it was too late. Daniel kept visiting after that day, though at first the silence between us felt heavier than conversation. He came every Sunday morning without warning, usually carrying coffee and looking unsure whether he should even step onto my porch. The first few visits were awkward, because guilt had replaced the arrogance he once carried so easily. I watched him carefully during those weeks because regret spoken too quickly means nothing. Real regret changes behavior slowly. One morning, he noticed the old wooden fence near the lake had collapsed during a storm, and without saying much, he spent 6 straight hours repairing it by hand. Another weekend, He cleaned the garage Eleanor used to organize before she died. He never asked for forgiveness directly. He simply kept showing up and working quietly, almost like he was trying to rebuild himself one task at a time. For the first time in years, I saw glimpses of the boy Eleanor and I raised before money and status poisoned his judgment. Then one evening, while we sat beside the lake watching the sunset, Daniel finally admitted something I had suspected for a long time. He confessed Vanessa's family had been pressuring him from the beginning because they believed he would eventually inherit everything I owned. According to him, Charles constantly compared family wealth and treated marriage like a business merger instead of a relationship. Vanessa slowly became obsessed with appearances too. Daniel admitted she once complained that my pickup truck being parked outside wedding venues would ruin the image they wanted people to see online. Hearing that didn't even anger me anymore because by then the truth felt obvious. What hurt more was Daniel confessing he knew those conversations were wrong but stayed quiet because he enjoyed being accepted into their wealthy social circle. He said he felt powerful standing beside people who looked down on ordinary families, and eventually he started doing the same thing himself without realizing it. That was the first truly honest thing he had said in years. A few weeks later, news spread publicly about the collapse of Charles Collins' investment firm. As it turned out, much of his wealth was built on debt, risky loans, and fake appearances designed to impress people. The luxury mansion was heavily mortgaged, several businesses were failing, and investors began pulling out money rapidly after financial investigations started. Suddenly, the same people who mocked humility were drowning behind closed doors. Daniel later told me Vanessa became cold and bitter almost overnight once financial pressure appeared because their relationship had always been built around image rather than loyalty. They argued constantly about money, status, and blame until finally she walked away entirely. What surprised Daniel most was how quickly the Collins family abandoned him after the wedding disaster. The people he sacrificed, his dignity disappeared the moment they realized he was no longer useful. One afternoon, Daniel asked me a question I never expected to hear from him. He asked whether I would have revealed my fortune at the wedding if he had defended me earlier. I answered honestly, no. If he had stood beside me while believing I was poor, none of that public humiliation would have happened. I would have quietly blessed the marriage, protected him financially, and respected the man he became. The money was never the test. Character was. He nodded slowly because deep down he already knew that answer before asking. Months passed, and gradually our relationship improved, though not perfectly. Some damage never fully disappears between parent and child once respect is broken. But Daniel changed in ways I could see clearly. He stopped chasing luxury. He sold expensive watches, canceled memberships at clubs he could no longer afford, and eventually took a management position at one of my smaller warehouses under a false last name because he wanted employees to judge him fairly rather than treat him like the owner's son. I allowed it because struggle teaches lessons comfort never can. The first months were brutal for him. Workers complained directly to his face. Supervisors criticized his mistakes without hesitation. He worked 12-hour shifts during winter storms loading damaged inventory after several trucks arrived late. But slowly he earned respect honestly, instead of borrowing it through status. One evening, an older warehouse worker named Miguel approached me privately and said, "Your son finally learned how to listen." That sentence meant more to me than any business award I ever received. Nearly a year after the wedding disaster, Daniel accompanied me to visit Eleanor's grave on her birthday. We stood there quietly while wind moved through the trees around the cemetery, and after several minutes, he finally broke down completely. Not the embarrassed tears from the wedding. Real tears. The kind that come from understanding the weight of your own failures. He apologized to his mother out loud for becoming selfish, arrogant, and weak when she spent her entire life teaching him better values. I placed my hand on his shoulder and realized something important in that moment. Revenge may expose people, but consequences are what transform them. Public humiliation at the wedding shattered Daniel's illusion about himself, but the difficult months afterward forced him to become someone different. As we walked back toward the car, he looked at me and quietly said, I spent years trying to impress people who would never sacrifice anything for me, while ignoring the man who sacrificed everything. I told him most people learn that lesson too late, if they learn it at all. Before driving away, Daniel glanced back at Eleanor's grave one last time and promised he would spend the rest of his life becoming someone worthy of carrying our family name again. And for the first time in many years, I believed him. Over the following year, Daniel continued rebuilding his life piece by piece, and I made sure not to make the process easy for him, because easy redemption usually creates temporary change instead of permanent character. He kept working at the warehouse under strict supervision, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after dark like every other employee. Many workers still